Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to step into the painful morning when Jack leaves for an overseas crisis and watch how one promise I'll call you every day, no matter how busy I am, becomes the only thread holding two hearts together across thousands of miles. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The morning came in quietly, almost gently, as if the world itself understood this was not an ordinary farewell. Pale sunlight slipped through the curtains and stretched across the wooden floor in long golden bands, touching the suitcase by the bed, the chair by the window, the half-open door, and finally, the stillness between two people who had barely slept. Somewhere far away, a bell rang once, then disappeared into silence. After that, the house seemed to hold its breath. Jack stood beside the bed, one hand resting on the edge of his open suitcase. He was dressed, but not fully ready. His movements were careful, methodical, almost too controlled, as if precision could keep the ache inside him from spreading. He checked his documents again: passport, phone, tickets, files from the overseas branch, charger, wallet. Then he paused with a shirt in his hand and stared for a second too long at nothing. Across the room, Tu Tien sat in the chair by the window. She had been awake since before dawn. Maybe before that. Sleep had never truly come. She sat with her fingers tightly interlocked in her lap, watching him in silence, afraid that even the smallest sound might make the moment too real. The light touched one side of her face, but it did nothing to soften the sadness there. She had spent the entire night turning the same thought over and over in her mind. By this evening, he would be thousands of miles away. A different country, a different time zone, a different rhythm of life. He would still be hers, and she would still be his. But the distance would enter the middle of everything, asking to be endured. She understood why he had to go. That was part of what made this harder. The overseas branch was in serious trouble. The kind of trouble that could not be solved over calls or delegated with a few confident instructions. They needed him there in person. They needed his judgment, his calm, his ability to step into chaos and make it hold still long enough to be repaired. She was proud of that part of him, deeply proud. But pride was a poor shield against loneliness. After a long silence, Tu Tien stood. Her steps were soft against the floorboards, almost soundless. Jack sensed her before she spoke and turned toward her immediately. The look on his face changed the moment he saw her. Whatever tension he had been hiding eased, replaced by something warmer, more vulnerable. For 1 second, he looked less like the man leaving to save a branch overseas and more like the one part of this house that made it feel safe. She stopped in front of him and looked down at his hands. Then she took one. That was all. No speech, no dramatic question, just her fingers slipping into his, holding on as if touch could memorize what absence would soon demand. Jack closed his hand around hers at once. His palm was warm, steady, reassuring in the exact way she had always needed him to be. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them was already full of dread, devotion, regret, and the unbearable tenderness of knowing goodbye was very close now. For a while, they just stood there. Then Jack lifted his free hand and brushed a strand of hair away from her forehead. It was such a familiar gesture that it nearly undid her. How many times had he done that without either of them thinking about it? And now, because he was leaving, even that small movement felt precious enough to hurt. "I have to go this time," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but softer than usual, as if he were trying not to let the weight of the morning spill into it too much. Tu Tien nodded. "I know." He watched her face, making sure she really meant it, making sure she was not saying the words only because she loved him too much to make his leaving harder. "The branch is worse than I expected," he continued. "They've delayed decisions for too long. If I don't go now, it will get harder to fix." Again she nodded, though every sentence tightened something inside her. She knew all of this already. He had explained it the night before, then again after midnight when neither of them could sleep. But hearing it in the daylight made it sound more final. Jack tightened his hold on her hand a little. "I'll handle it as fast as I can," he said. "I won't stay a day longer than I have to." She looked up at him then, her eyes glistening but steady. "And you'll call me?" A sad smile touched his face. "Every day. No matter how busy?" No matter how busy. There was something almost sacred in the way he said it, not exaggerated, not romantic for effect. It was simply a promise made by a man who understood what hearing his voice would mean to her when the night stretched too long. He knew distance did strange things to time. He knew what silence could become if left unattended. So he offered her the only thing he could guarantee: consistency, his voice, his presence in whatever form he could give it. "I'll call even if it's late," he said, "even if it's just for a few minutes. I want you to hear me. I want you to know I'm all right." Those words reached her like cool rain over something scorched and frightened. She committed every tone, every pause, every breath in his voice to memory. If absence was coming, she would not let it take his cadence from her too. Outside, the sound of a car engine started faintly on the road. The waiting car. Both of them heard it. The fragile stillness of the morning broke at once. Jack looked toward the door, then back at her. He picked up the suitcase, and suddenly the room felt too small, too bright, too sharp around the edges. Together, they walked outside. The air was cool and carried the scent of flowers from the little garden they had planted together months ago. The path was the same one they had walked side by side so many times, laughing, talking, sometimes saying nothing at all. But today, every step toward the gate felt heavier than the last. The house stood behind them in quiet witness. The iron gate opened with the same familiar sound. The street beyond was empty except for the car waiting near the curb, engine humming low, patient, and impossible to ignore. The sky above was clear, almost painfully beautiful. Everything around them looked normal. That was what made the sorrow feel so sharp. Nothing outside them had changed, and yet inside, an entire world was shifting. When they reached the car, Tu Tien stopped. Not dramatically, not with some great gesture. She simply halted as if her body had reached the point beyond which it could not pretend calm anymore. Jack saw it immediately. He set the suitcase down without looking away from her. Then he stepped closer and pulled her into his arms. She went willingly, instantly, wrapping herself around him with the kind of force people only use when they are trying to hold on to something already moving away. Her face pressed against his chest. His heartbeat was strong and familiar under her cheek. She listened to it like it was the last safe sound in the world. Jack held her just as tightly, one hand at the back of her head, the other around her shoulders, feeling the faint tremor in her body and hating the fact that duty had made him the cause of it. "Don't worry too much," he whispered into her hair. She almost laughed at that, except the tears were already there. "I'll solve everything there as quickly as I can," he said, "and then I'll come home." Slowly, she lifted her face. Her eyes were red now, but she was still trying to smile for him. Still trying to give him strength instead of making him carry all of hers too. Jack reached up and wiped the tear from her cheek with his thumb so carefully it felt like an apology. "I'll wait for you," she said softly. Her voice trembled, but the meaning did not. "No matter how long it takes." Jack's smile came then, the warm one, the one that had steadied her through worse days than this. He cupped her face in both hands and held her gaze. "You won't have to wait long," he said. "Just take care of yourself. Wait for me. I'll come back soon." And for one suspended second, with the morning light on her face and his hands warm against her skin, she believed him so completely that it hurt. Then he picked up the suitcase and reached for the car door. The car door closed with a dull, final sound that seemed far louder than it should have. Jack looked at her through the window for one last second. Then the driver pulled away from the curb and the car began moving down the familiar street. It was not fast, not dramatic, Just a slow, steady departure through a neighborhood that still looked exactly the same as it had yesterday and the day before that, and all the ordinary days when she had never once imagined how empty it could suddenly feel. Tu Tien stood by the gate and did not move. She didn't wave, didn't call after him, didn't run forward. She only stood there with her arms hanging still at her sides, eyes fixed on the back of the car as if she could hold it in place through sheer refusal to blink. The little garden beside the path rustled softly in the breeze, carrying up the scent of flowers they had planted together. Once, that scent had meant homecoming, evenings, shared tea, his footsteps at the door. Today, it seemed to belong to another life. The road stretched straight beneath the morning sun, bright and calm and indifferent. With each meter the car moved, the distance between them felt less physical and more impossible. She could still see him for a few seconds through the rear window, only as shaped now, then only as the idea of him. Then the car reached the bend at the end of the road and disappeared. The silence afterward was immense. Wind moved through the trees, leaves whispered. Somewhere far away, a dog barked once and was quiet again. But inside Tu Tien, time seemed to stop. There was no sound but the violent rhythm of her own heart, still trying to follow him down a road it could not travel. She stayed where she was longer than she meant to. Not because she believed he would come back around the corner, but because moving felt like agreeing that he was truly gone, and she wasn't ready to do that yet. A strange numbness spread through her first, then a slower ache that settled deeper and deeper with every passing second. Longing did not arrive dramatically. It entered the way water enters stone, quietly, persistently, changing everything without asking permission. He had promised he would call. He had promised he would return. She held on to those promises because there was nothing else to hold. At last, when the road had been empty for too long and the sunlight had shifted slightly against the gate, Tu Tien turned back toward the house. Her shadow stretched ahead of her on the stone path, thin and lonely in the morning light. Each step toward the door felt heavier than it should have. The house stood open, waiting. The same house, the same rooms, the same table, the same windows. And yet from the moment the car vanished, everything inside it had become altered by absence. She stepped in and closed the door behind her. The sound echoed more sharply than she expected. It made the whole place feel larger at once, not because the rooms had changed, but because Jack was no longer in them. His presence had always done something subtle to the house, filled the corners, softened the air, turned ordinary objects into part of a life shared. Without him, everything was suddenly too still, too visible, too separate. Sunlight still lay across the wooden floor in warm stripes. The coffee cup he had used that morning sat on the table exactly where he had left it, the surface inside still holding the faintest ring of dark coffee. His book remained on the sofa, open and face down where he must have set it aside the night before. His jacket hung near the door, one sleeve turned inward awkwardly, still carrying the trace of his familiar cologne. Tu Tien stood in the middle of the room and looked at those small things as if they had become sacred. Each one was ordinary, each one hurt. She moved first toward the jacket. Her fingers brushed the fabric lightly, almost shyly, as if she were touching the edge of something alive. The scent was still there, faint now, but unmistakable. Her throat tightened immediately. Memory came with it in a rush. Mornings when he shrugged that same jacket on while teasing her for still being half asleep. Evenings when he came in from work and tossed it carelessly over the chair before pulling her into a quick embrace. Rainy nights when she had pressed her face into that shoulder and believed, without question, that nothing bad could reach her while he was close. She let her hand fall. Then she crossed to the sofa and sat down very slowly, exactly where they always sat together at the end of the day. The cushion gave beneath her weight, familiar and wrong all at once. She looked around the room, and every object seemed to open into memory. The open book, the coffee cup, the indentation on the pillow from where he had rested his arm, the silence where his voice should have been. Tears came then, quietly, without resistance. She did not wipe them away. There was no point pretending she was stronger than this. Sorrow had its own dignity. It didn't need to be hidden just because it was expected. For a long while, she sat there and let herself remember. Morning coffee made by his hands because he knew she never wanted to leave bed when the weather turned cold. Late night reading with both of them pretending to focus on their own pages while secretly watching the other. His way of pausing at the door when he came home, just long enough to find her with his eyes before he did anything else. The small things. Always the small things. Those were what built a life. Those were what absence tore open first. By afternoon, the emptiness had changed shape. It was no longer the shock of departure. It had become routine interrupted. Every part of the day now revealed where he should have been. She moved through the house slowly, putting small things right just to keep her hands occupied. She folded the blanket on the sofa, rinsed the coffee cup, closed the book, and set it neatly beside the lamp. But no act of order could disguise what was missing. That night, she lay on one side of the bed and reached instinctively toward the other before remembering. The cold sheet under her hand nearly made her pull away as if burned. Sleep came badly, in fragments. When she woke, her first glance still went to the empty side beside her, and for a second each morning she had to relive the leaving all over again. The days moved strangely after that, both too slowly and too fast in the wrong places. She filled them the only way she knew how. She tended the garden because plants did not stop needing water just because the house felt hollow. She cooked because bodies still needed feeding even when appetite had become unreliable. Sometimes she walked to the park where they used to go together on weekends, following the same paths, passing the same benches, letting memory walk beside her like a quiet second shadow. And through all of it, she carried the same private hope. Somewhere under another sky, he was thinking of her too. He never failed her, not once. No matter how long his workday ran overseas, no matter how tired he looked when the screen lit up and his face appeared, he always found a way to call. Sometimes it was late, sometimes the connection was weak. Once or twice, the conversation lasted only a few minutes because people were still waiting for him just off camera. But he called, and each time, the house changed again. The moment his face appeared, weary but smiling, the distance seemed to bend. Not disappear, but bend enough that breathing became easier. He told her about the branch, about problems that were more tangled than he had expected, about meetings that seemed endless, about systems that had to be rebuilt one piece at a time. She listened carefully, never interrupting, offering the kind of steady comfort that didn't demand anything from him except honesty. "You need to rest too," she reminded him once. He smiled tiredly. "I will, after this is done. You always say that, and you always tell me to sleep, because someone has to." That made him laugh, and the sound traveled through the phone like warmth. Those calls became the thread that held the days together. She lived by them more than she wanted to admit. Morning was waiting, afternoon was waiting, evening was relief. He, on the other side of the world, worked harder because each passing day meant one day closer to driving back through that same gate. And under the same vast sky, though miles and time zones lay between them, they both kept the same faith alive. One day soon, the sound of a car would return to the street. The gate would open. The house would breathe again. And he would step back into the space his absence had left waiting for him. As dawn breaks, Jack prepares to leave for an overseas branch in crisis, while Tu Tien watches in silence, already carrying the weight of separation before he has even gone. Their goodbye is quiet but deeply emotional, filled with promises, trembling hands, and the kind of love that needs no dramatic words to be felt. At the gate, Jack holds her tightly, vows to return soon, and promises to call every single day no matter how busy things become. Once the car disappears, the house feels instantly larger and emptier. Every familiar object, his coffee cup, his open book, His jacket by the door becomes a painful reminder of his absence. Yet, as the days pass, Tu Tien keeps moving through her routines, holding on to faith rather than despair. True to his word, Jack never forgets to call. Across different countries and time zones, their daily calls become the invisible thread that keeps their love alive while both of them wait for the day he